Okay. Get that started. There we go. Well, friends, we've been following in our lectionary series a bit in the background, actually, because we've been looking at a sermon series on the Nicene Creed for the last 6 or 7 weeks or so. But in the background, we've been reading through the book of Genesis. And today I thought we might focus on the character of Jacob, because he's been popping up in these readings as we've been going through our little sermon series. In the background, we've got Jacob bubbling away there and all these bizarre stories of his life. And he's been up to a few things, our boy Jacob. Last week he was tricked into marrying Leah instead of Rachel, if you remember that reading. Earlier before, he tricks his brother Esau into selling his birthright to Jacob, to his father's inheritance. And today we see him wrestle with a man, or in some translations it says with an angel, but we do find out that who he is wrestling with is indeed God. So he's been up to he's had an interesting life, Jacob, and he's a bit older in this story, but certainly his life has been quite the story. Now, 2 things happen in our encounter today with Jacob, don't they? We've got Jacob getting a new name. He's called Israel, and he walks forever with a limp after his encounter with God. And that's where we find ourselves today, friends, wrestling with God, and also to explore the concept of blessing, because we see blessing throughout our readings today. We saw Jesus blessing and breaking the loaves and the fishes and having them multiply, which is what happens at Sunday night on occasion, when we have all these people show up and we have to bless and break the food that's been made to feed the 5,000, which is wonderful. Good job, volunteers, for that one. But certainly we see Jesus do that, and we see this same concept happening in the Old Testament. But even in that passage of Romans, Paul's talking about the blessings that are passed down from God through the people of Israel, and what that means for us in our walk with God today. So, blessing is life in the Bible. That's what it means. It's life that can reproduce itself, which we see Jesus doing with the loaves and fishes. And God chooses humans out of all the animals to represent him, doesn't he, out of creation, and to partner with him to take care of his blessing. And that's our calling, really. We're stewards of God's blessing. That's what we're here to do as people. And we've proven pretty bad at it, really, if we're honest. If we look back at Adam and Eve, we see them, not doing so well. They fail. Noah, likewise, and this is just Genesis, let alone the rest of the Bible. And then God chooses a guy called Abraham, and he blesses Abraham, and he says, Abraham, your family will be the family that I will use to bless the entire world, which is a fairly big promise. But even with that knowledge, Abraham still struggles with his life and doing the right thing and following God's laws and so on and so forth. And it makes you wonder, God, what are you thinking? Partnering with humans to have us be blessings and to bless us. Or is he just choosing the wrong people, perhaps? If you go through the Bible, you'll find just people not living up to the standards that we should be living up to. And in the last few weeks, we've been introduced to Abraham's grandson, which is Jacob. And if you thought Abraham struggled or Adam and Eve struggled, you wait till we talk about Jacob. Jacob is such a horrendous person that his name means trickster. That's what it means in the Hebrew. It actually means trickster and the heel grabber, but I'll get to that in a minute. And story after story, he's scheming, he's lying, he's deceiving people. This is the man who's meant to extend God's blessing to the world, is just this chaos monster. He just goes around creating chaos wherever he goes. The whole story of Jacob is about him trying to grab and scheme his own way into getting the blessing from God that God was going to give him all along. He's a very unusual character, Jacob. The stories of Jacob are painful, but they're an honest, that's why I like them, they're an honest examination of how stubborn and selfish and nearsighted people can be, myself included, right? And as you hear them read at church, you might be thinking, why hasn't God given up on us? Really, what are you doing, Jacob? Come on. Now, blessing, the word blessing is one of those words that may mean a lot of different things depending on where you use it, right? So we talk about things like bless this meal, God bless you. I'm always saying God bless you to people. You might say it when you sneeze. I feel blessed when life is going good and so forth. So it's easy to kind of imagine what we understand blessing to be. But if we look at how the Bible talks about blessing, it's a little bit different. But if you look on page 1, which is Genesis chapter 1, God creates creatures. So he creates the birds and the fish. And this is the first time we get the word blessed or blessed. God blesses these creatures, and the blessing is really specific. He says, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. So blessing in the Bible is about abundant life for the birds and the fish and the creation, which includes us. It's like God donates or gives some of his ability to produce to creation. And that's what blessing is. It's divine love giving the potential of creation to another being. And that's what we call blessing. So it's important that we understand that blessing is about being fruitful and multiplying. Now, that could look very different for each person, but in this particular understanding in Genesis, it's about procreation, children, having more to be fruitful and multiply. Now, if you remember the story of Genesis, early on with Adam and Eve, God curses. This is the opposite of blessing now. He curses the serpent, the creature that deceived the humans, and then God curses the ground, which is the environment from which the abundance of food comes from. So the food that is multiplied. And the word curse in Hebrew isn't actually used here. But what God's really saying, it's a bit like this. It says, look, the relationship of humanity, of multiplying, is going to be rough from now on. So it's a little bit different to our understanding of curse. But it's going to be fraught with conflict, because humans have chosen to take what God defines as death and make that into blessing. That's really the story of fallen humanity. And so as humans, we end up striving for what we think is blessing, but end up hurting each other. And humans are always trying to get their own version of God's blessing, myself included here. When I talk like this, I include me. I am also part of human and God's creation as well. So we all do it. It's very normal. That's because we're broken, fallen humans. Now, when Jacob was born, if you remember, he was born holding on to Esau's foot. They're twins, so one came out holding on to the other. And he was holding him by the heel. And if you haven't noticed by now, but God's got a way of flipping things on their head. Like he turns what we understand as good or bad around the other way. You would expect the firstborn to be promised everything, really. That's just how we understand the world. And especially in the ancient world, the firstborn, particularly the son, because that's just how it worked. If you only had daughters, that was very complicated. But certainly the firstborn son was entitled to everything. But years before Jacob is born, all through his family tree, God's granting the secondborn the really important role in the promise. So he's actually granting it to the secondborn. Now, back to Jacob being born clutching Esau's ankle. In Hebrew, Jacob's full name, as I mentioned briefly earlier, it's Jacob the heel grabber. Like it's a full Hebrew title, which I'm not going to go into here. But a heel grabber is another way to say deceptive. Because it comes from the image of tripping up someone, or if you play rugby league, if you do the ankle tap, you can really topple someone over. But if you're grabbing someone's heel, you can really make them quite vulnerable, really make them quite subject to be able to be hurt quite easily. So it's significant his name refers to this role because he's trying to outdo his brother all the time and everybody else. And he's born doing it. He's born trying to take power from his firstborn brother. So And it's interesting, this happens right after God says, the greater one will become a servant to the little one. So Esau will become a servant to Jacob. So what God is saying is, hey, I've destined the younger to become the one with authority. But when the second-born is born, that's Jacob, he comes out showing a lack of trust in that promise. He's born that way, in a way. He comes out grabbing his brother to try and accomplish the thing that God said he was going to do for him all along. It's a very bizarre story. He doesn't have the trust. Jacob doesn't have the trust. So that becomes the drama of the Jacob story, and it's a remarkable story. It's like a scene of someone trying to give a gift to another person, but they're just so uncomfortable with it. Have you ever done that before? And you want to give someone a present, and they're just like, oh my goodness, I can't take this. It's too much. This is too nice. You're too lovely. This happens to me. I get gifts and compliments, and I go, oh, thank you. You know, I'm really uncomfortable with them, and it's strange to receive gifts and presents, and the other person just wants to be generous, right? And you might be that person. I just want to be generous to this person. I just want to tell them that I appreciate them, or they're loved, or whatever it is. And that's a bit like Jacob. If you feel a little bit uncomfortable when that happens for you, that's a bit like Jacob, but exaggerated, right? His whole life is like this. He comes out grabbing for the thing that God said he would give him, and the pattern continues all through his story. So it's as if Jacob is just unaware of what God said about him, or he can't believe it. Maybe he just can't get his head around what is actually being promised to him, but he spends his energy, his whole life, scheming to get the thing that God has already promised for him. So he's a guy who doesn't believe that God is going to bless him. He goes throughout his whole life hurting everybody around him, trying to scheme and steal and take things that God has already promised to give him. So Jacob is a deceiver. We get to that point, right? And what's God got to do with a guy who just won't take his gift? And this accumulates in the story that we heard today in Genesis 32. God picks a fight with him. Which is a bit weird to say, isn't it? God's coming to pick a fight with Jacob, but he does. He comes along and picks a fight with him. Jacob's sleeping by himself. It's the night before it actually comes right before he's about to go and meet Esau again for the first time in 20 years, because remember, they've fallen out over, Jacob stealing Esau's birthright. And there's this guy, a man, you're just told he's a man. We don't really know much about him, but we do infer that he is God a bit later in the passage. He picks a fight with him by the stream in the middle of the night, right before sunrise. And this man does something interesting. He strikes the hollow of Jacob's thigh so hard that it dislocates his hip. His hip's been brought out of the socket, out of his thigh. Now you've got to wonder, why and how hard do you have to be hit there to dislocate your thigh? So the thing we might miss in translation, friends, is that this man punches Jacob in the crutch, in the groin. So pretty hard, right? And remember, if we go back to the beginning of the sermon, the core image of blessing is multiplication. And on reproductive anatomy on a male, that's where it is, the source of the blessing. You think the Bible is a little bit sanitized, and actually no, God's going around punching people in the crutch. You didn't know that was in there, did you? You do now. Now, why does Jacob think this guy can bless him? That's the real question, because he says, I'm not going anywhere until you bless me. So Jacob's got a bit of an idea what's going on here. And the guy says to Jacob, what's your name? And he says, Yaakov, which is Jacob in Hebrew, which means Jacob, the heel grabber. And the man says, no. Your name is now no longer Jacob. God likes to do this. He renames people all the time. Rather, your name's going to be Struggles with God, Ya Israel, or Israel, as we come to know it today. Israel means wrestles with God, because you have struggled with God and with humans, and you've prevailed. You've come through the other end. You've got this way of scheming out of any situation, but you have been struggling with me. You struggle with God. And you could put it this way, there's an irresistible force that God desires to bless his people and, personified in Jacob. And there's a stubborn force that just won't let him bless anyone. It's a very human story. It's a story of human selfishness, of pride, of thinking we can do it all by ourselves. No, I will steal the blessing myself. I can't trust God to do it. And it's as if God has been trying to bless this guy. This guy lives his whole life scheming, manipulating everyone around him to get the thing that God has been trying to give him all along. So what has God got to do? He's got to wound him. He has to wound Jacob. He has to incapacitate him in the part of the body where he can generate his own blessing. Okay? You're not doing this on your own anymore, Jacob. This is up to me now. It's a powerful image of God having to both wound and heal. So he's wounding him to heal him, actually, to strike and to bless him, to get humans to receive the thing he's trying to get them to receive. That's really what this story is about. So friends, as we wrap up our story today on Jacob, there's a lot more we could say, but that's really what it's about. We know that from our walk with God here today, that he doesn't cause bad things to happen to us. It's just sometimes he does need to get our attention. And I know this from first-hand experience. Sometimes he needs to get our attention in a very deep and moving way. Hopefully he's not going to punch anybody here in the groin or anybody or anywhere. And hopefully that won't be the thing. But I do wonder, friends, how is God trying to get your attention? Because that's what I pondered this week. I thought, why am I being drawn to the Jacob story? Well, it's about blessing and multiplying. How is God trying to get my attention? How is God trying to get your attention? How is God trying to get our attention as the church? And if you're a bit like me, you might find it hard to accept that God wants to bless you. God wants you to live and to flourish. And if you find that hard, have some gentle curiosity about yourself as to why that might be. There could be something that's holding you back in that way. And that might be something that stops you from receiving God's blessing. Because, friends, St. Paul tells us in that second reading that the overall message of God is that we too, friends, are inheritors of God's blessing. Amen.
Amen.